Yeah.
All right. Welcome, everybody. I am, welcome. Thank you all for joining us in. I'm gonna try to admit everybody coming in. Thank you for being patient with the last session. Dr. Messina, that was really difficult getting everyone, I know everyone had to wait. Technical glitches happen, things like that. We have with us Dr. Richard Plavnieks, who's going to speak to us today. But before we get into that, I want to make sure we're going to continue this on. If you feel that you have to leave and can't stay on, if you need to go at 3, I won't hold it against you. So please just watch the recorded session. I'm able to see if you actually watch the recorded session. This is a great session that we've got lined up for you here. I know the last one went over. If you had any issues, even there is with the last presentation, or you didn't get to see it, or there were any complications, go through and download the slides that are posted there. If you want the entire slideshow, I'll be happy to send you that as well. Richard Plavnieks is the Assistant Director, Professor of History at Florida Southern College. He has a very extensive history that I hope he'll explain to you and talk about. I believe he actually, you got your PhD studying under Dr. Browning, who wrote Ordinary Men, which is really amazing if you get a chance to pick up the book. But of course, I was talking with Dr. Katz earlier, and he has different perspectives. We've got a lot of great views here, but he's going to talk to you about modern racial anti-Semitism and Germanophone politics. And I'm going to turn it over to him, so no more time is spent wasted listening to me go on and on. Dr. Plavnieks, thank you so much for coming out and seeing us today.
Of course. No, thank you a lot, Stephen. I'm going to try pasting some terms into the chat, and those terms can kind of help guide you through the lecture. So let me know if this is.
Let me also, I'm going to make you a co-host. So if you need to share your screen or anything,
I definitely would like to do that.
You'll be able to share your screen.
Darn, I see that on the formatting of but all of those words constitute the terms, and if you just, I'll be going through those kind of sequentially, and so that should help serve as a guide. And I will be sharing my screen so that you can see some visuals that'll also help you kind of follow along with what I'm saying. So what I'm going to try to do is to give you a brief but more or less comprehensive history of anti-Semitism, its origins in the Roman Empire, through its medieval Christian development, up through its putatively scientific, modern, mature form. And then we will focus on German anti-Semitism in the 19th century. Hitler was born in 1889. And so it was that environment that incubated Hitler. And then the last thing we'll examine is the innovative Nazi variant of anti-Semitism, the quote unquote logic of which necessitated the Holocaust. So first and foremost, I want you to forget the idea, which is a silly idea, that history somehow repeats itself. It's kind of fatuous when you think about it, and there's far too many variables. So what is actually true is not that history repeats itself, but it's that history never stops. History just never stops. And so the modern era, which is our era, which is the era that began with the Enlightenment and the challenging notion that all men are created equal and have the same rights and should be entitled to impartial law. The entire modern era can be read as a giant global ongoing struggle between democratizing forces and exclusionary forces. So history doesn't repeat, it just never stops. And this contest is ongoing. The challenge is that there are real differences between peoples, different cultures, different religions and belief systems, and so on. And the project of the Enlightenment is to create a political framework in which irreducibly different groups can live and work together in peace. So there are real differences that are just gonna exist. People who harbor xenophobic views, which I'll define shortly, oppose the efforts to create an integrated society and instead seek to exclude groups who aren't theirs from civic life, marginalize them one way or the other, disenfranchisement, persecution, apartheid, segregation. And people who hold xenophobic views are particularly dangerous when they feel that they're losing the struggle against the forces of integration. In other words, when they feel aggrieved, because based on their pre-existing xenophobic prejudices, they can be led to embrace chimeric beliefs, beliefs that are untethered to reality, fantasies. Chimerical fantasies give license to any kind of response. They justify any radical action. The Holocaust was such an action, undertaken because of the propagation of chimeric beliefs against the Jews. And so Nazi Germany's defeat was a milestone, but history continues. And the factors, this is the point, the factors that enabled a Nazi Germany are intrinsic to the human condition, unfortunately. The propensity to be suspicious of other groups of people who you don't really understand, the readiness to think xenophobic things about them and to scapegoat them, and then finally, the susceptibility to chimeric fantasies that are illusory, but appear to provide clear answers, often packaged to appear sophisticated in the form of conspiracy theories or secret knowledge, often provided by some magical man who alone can fix it. So that's what I want to tell you about today. I want to say a couple things at the outset. So number one, I apologize if this is a little bit intense because I've got a lot to cover. And so I'll tell you up front that I will be going pretty fast. And then the other note I want to say at the outset is that you'll notice that apart from Jesus and a few of the New Testament authors that I'll just breeze through at the top, there aren't going to be any actual Jews at all in this lecture. Because we're not talking about the actual human beings who are just trying to live their lives and enjoy their lives and find their love and do their work and whatever. We're going to only see the imaginary Jew, the demonized other of the propaganda imagery. So understand that at the outset. And so with that, let me begin sharing my screen. So is that coming through? Stephen, can you let me know if that's coming through?
Yeah, it's good. We're good.
Okay, good. So the Jewish diaspora, so the reason that Jews were scattered throughout Europe in the 20th century goes all the way back to the era of the Roman Empire. Rome controlled the province of Judea, and as they had numerous other previous occupiers going back to Babylon, the Jews in Judea resisted this foreign oppressor, and it created a kind of fermentation that gave rise to Christ, who came as a prophet in the Jewish traditions and so on. And that the rebellion that the Jews began in the late 60s AD was crushed by the 10th Legion of the Roman army, and the Jews were dispersed. In effect, they were deported from the Promised Land en masse, and hence Jews spread throughout the Mediterranean basin. And of course, the what Christianity really was when it began was a schismatic sectarian group within Judaism, entirely within Judaism. The authors of the Gospels, who lived decades after Christ, sought to distinguish their group from the Jews in the eyes of Roman authorities. So the Gospel of John is the one that Mel Gibson based his movie The Passion of the Christ on, which is extremely graphic, lurid depiction of the torture of a human being. But even Matthew, which is a mild gospel that contains the Beatitudes, when describing Pontius Pilate washing his hands of responsibility for Jesus's execution, it's chapter 27, verse 25. All the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." So in other words, the early gospel authors differentiated, distinguished Christians from Jews because the Jews were a public enemy in Roman eyes. And so the Christ killer accusation is in the foundational texts of the New Testament, and the Vatican won't revise its dogmas concerning the collective responsibility of all Jews for the death of Christ until 1962. So that's a big deal. The church fathers, so Christianity sort of spreads across the Eastern Mediterranean and moves further west. Various eclectic Christ follower groups spring up in town after town. Paul, who is the author of about a quarter of the New Testament in the form of his letters to these various churches, begins the process of kind of codifying a theology out of these Jesus stories. But it's really the church fathers in the 300s who formally create a theology for Christianity that could be respected by philosophers in the Mediterranean region. And under the aegis of Constantine, this is shows this is from the Arch of Titus, showing the loot that the 10th Legion brought back to Rome after the sacking of the temple. The Emperor Constantine fought a battle, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, in the year 312, crediting his victory over a would-be usurper to the Christian God. And under Constantine's aegis, which is to say the aegis of the Roman Imperium, the Council of Nicaea created an actual creed, the Nicene Creed, that anybody who could say those words, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and so on, would be regarded as Christians and tolerated by the Roman state. And then the process of formally Christianizing the Roman Empire was completed in the 390s by the Emperor Theodosius, who said, not only will the Roman state tolerate you if you're Christian, but in fact, now the Roman state has made it mandatory that you be Christian. And in this Christian empire, every religion save the Jews was persecuted to extinction. And so it became a Christian empire, and this was viewed as a vindication of Christianity and gave rise to the theology of supersession, which is to say that we have appropriated the Jewish holy books, which we Christians now call the Old Testament, to which we have added a New Testament. And because of the Jews' rejection of Christ's divinity, we are now the chosen people, not them. However, we won't kill them all. We anticipate their gradual conversion, and in the meantime, we will suffer them to live among us as reminders of the terrible fate that awaits anybody who doubts. And then civilization collapsed, so, which we don't have time to get into. What emerged following the end of civilization and the collapse of the Western Roman Empire was, of course, feudalism. Feudalism. And it's in the feudal context of the Middle Ages that anti-Jewish ideas kind of expand or metastasize maybe into xenophobic beliefs about Jews. And here I'm going to introduce you to a scholar named Gavin Langmuir, whose work on prejudice I cannot recommend highly enough. According to Langmuir, there are 3 levels at which prejudice can operate. And I'm a historian, so I have a reflexive suspicion of schema in the social sciences generally, because I think that individual humans, let alone human groups, are too complex to really model on charts and so on. But I think the framework that Langmuir provides us is very useful as a model. So at the basic level, Langmuir says there are realistic prejudices. And so an example of a realistic prejudice is, look, Jews are different from us because we're all Christians. And that difference is not made up. That is a real difference. We believe that Jesus is divine and they do not. And so if you hold a prejudice, well, I'm not going to, I don't know enough about them and so on. There's a realistic basis because there's an actual difference. Moving up the scale of prejudices, there's an inverse relationship between the validity of the claims and the level of lethality. So a xenophobic prejudice is a prejudice that is rooted in observable reality to some degree. There is a kernel of truth behind the xenophobic prejudice, but the prejudice is blown way out of proportion and extrapolated unfairly and becomes a stereotype and so on. And then finally, at the high range of prejudice, according to Langmuir, is chimeric prejudice, which is a prejudice that has no basis in reality whatsoever, and that is the deadliest kind of prejudice. And so I'll show you some examples of both of these from the Middle Ages, because it's really during the Middle Ages that the stereotypes against Jews that persist to this day develop. And so in medieval Europe, it's a caste system. Everything is based on the hereditary principle, which means everything boils down to who the baby daddy is. If you are the son of a peasant, congratulations, you're a peasant. If you're the son of a king, you get to be the next king, right? The hereditary principle. And so in this system, Jews were held to be weak and cowardly. Why was that? So Jews were forbidden from owning land in the Middle Ages. And the landowning caste, which was the second estate, was also the military estate, the lords. All of the knights and so on, they had land, they had fiefs. And so because Jews couldn't own land, therefore they also couldn't carry weapons, therefore they're cowards. See how that works? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Christian majority imposes a stricture on the Jewish minority. The Jewish minority complies, and then the Christian majority condemns them and stereotypes them. It's a xenophobic prejudice. Here's another one. Jews are insular and clannish. They only hang out with one another. They never come over and see what we're doing and whatever. They're thick as thieves. They hang with themselves. Maybe that's because they were confined to ghettos every night and locked in, right? So another self-fulfilling prophecy. Or how about this? Jews are greedy and parasitical. Jews are greedy and parasitical. Why? Well, the Catholic Church held that lending money at interest was a mortal sin. God sends you to hell for doing that. However, as the early Middle Ages mature into the High Middle Ages, around the year 1000 or 1100, say, accumulations of capital are required to facilitate capital projects like bridges or ships, over the horizon trade, and so on. And since the Jews are all going to hell anyways, let's make them be the bankers. And therefore they're greedy. So you can see just the mass of unfairness that the Jews had to face in medieval Europe, completely based on what was originally a theological difference, which, because they're so marginalized in society, gradually becomes just a heap of xenophobic prejudices. But it gets worse than that, gets far worse than that. So the Middle Ages was a pretty terrible time, I think. If you build a time machine, particularly if you're not male, you definitely don't want to go back to the Middle Ages. So 1348, there's a plague that wipes out anywhere up to about half of the total population of the continent. The crisis of the 14th century also saw 3 separate popes at the same time. There's wars, pestilence, disease, and of course the church teaches that everything down here is the way it is because it's all connected in a great chain of being. And medieval society, and the hereditary principle in particular, were supposed to guarantee, if nothing else, at least stability. There's no social mobility in the Middle Ages, right? If you're born of a peasant, you're going to be a peasant no matter what. It's your social station. That's why in Game of Thrones, it's such a big deal if somebody is a bastard, because that means they don't belong anywhere. And so the medieval society was supposed to be a static system, and it wasn't. And whenever there were shocks to that system, people, society, Christian majority society had anxieties. And the doubt that those shocks to the system produced manifested itself in actions against the Jews, who embodied doubt because they were the ones who never accepted Christ. And so a whole series of chimeric fantasies develop around the Jews. One of them is the blood libel. So in 1150, a kid named Hugh goes missing in the city of Lincoln, England. And the priest makes up that the Jews took him to drain his blood for use in various, evil Jewish rites. And they held all kinds of insane beliefs, like that when they're born, Jews' hands are fused like this, and it has to be dipped in the pure blood of an innocent Christian child for them to separate their hands, because God fuses their hands like that to make them, to remind them to repent and become Christian and whatnot. And I mean, in the Middle Ages, the life expectancy, if you were among the 20 to 30% of people who survived to adulthood, is still less than 40. Nobody's got so much as a kindergarten education except a few people in the church, so they can kind of be forgiven for believing utter nonsense, especially when you consider that nobody knew who the Jews were because they were totally segregated from the rest of society. Another example is the desecration of the host. The host is the communion wafer. The Eucharist is arguably the most holy sacrament in Christendom in the Middle Ages. It's a reenactment of the Last Supper, when Jesus, knowing that he was going to be killed, gave his disciples wine and said, "This is my blood, drink this for the remission of your sins," and gave them bread and said, "Take and eat, this is my body given for you in the remission of sins." And they reenact that in the churches. It's called the Eucharist, and they give you the wine and the wafer. They believed, the Christians in Europe believed, that in a metaphysical sense, which is to say a sense that is more real than our poor fallen mortal senses can perceive, that wafer, once blessed, actually is transubstantiated, becomes the body of Christ. And so, everybody in the Middle Ages lives in poverty and squalor. The one group of people in the Middle Ages who had a lot of gold was the church. So churches would get knocked over, burglarized. People would steal the gold. And no parish priest wants to admit that his own congregation is responsible for stealing from the house of the Lord. So you just blame the Jews. The Jews broke in to steal the blessed wafers and continue the mutilation and torture of Christ that Matthew told us they did, back when Jesus was first being crucified. The desecration of the host. So we know for a fact that never happened because, newsflash, as Jews, they don't believe that those are anything except for crackers, and they're certainly not going to put their lives and the lives of everybody in their community in danger to break into a church and do something like that. So it is a pure fantasy. And yet everyone in Europe knew that Jews did this. This is what they do. And of course, pogroms. So every Easter, there'd be an annual massacre of Jews when the priests got people fired up about the crucifixion of the Lord. Of course, Jews in the Middle Ages in Europe were constantly denigrated and abused, occasionally lynched, blamed for plague outbreaks, confined to ghettos, and often expelled as a stepping stone to state centralization. So monarchs would often dispossess the Jewish population in their particular realm and expel them, and then use their wealth to help construct their state. And so France deported every single French Jew in 1182. England deported all of the Jews of England in 1290. Spain deported the Jews in 1492. I mean, it was either you leave the country, you convert to Christianity, or you can be killed. Jews, furthermore, were the negative foil for everything in European intellectual life, everything. I can't recommend highly enough a book by David Nierenberg called Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition. But I mean, just dig these two examples just to get a sense of it. Martin Luther, so 1517, the 95 Theses and all that. Martin Luther, founder of Protestantism, condemned the Catholic Church for being too Jewish in its legalism and its obscurantism and its devotion to ritual and its superficial focus on works rather than the pure spirit and faith alone. So Luther condemns the Catholics for being Jews, right? So any bad guy is likened or compared somehow to the Jews, quote unquote. And of course, the beloved Shakespeare. Shakespeare, in his play, The Merchant of Venice, in 1600, in The Merchant of Venice, that's what gives us the character of Shylock, which is why you should never use the word shyster. It's an anti-Semitic slur. Shylock is a moneylender who lends money to the titular merchant of Venice, knowing that the protagonist will not be able to pay him back, and is licking his chops at the prospect of being able to cut a pound of flesh off of the protagonist because the protagonist is in love with his daughter. And so there hadn't been a Jew in England for 300 years when Shakespeare wrote that play. But Shakespeare knew who the Jews were, and he expected his audience to know who the Jews were. And so we can't, the Jews were the only minority suffered to live in medieval Europe. And it was, it was just unspeakably bad. And so all of that should have been over. So now we're going to leave the Middle Ages gratefully and enter the modern period. It all should have been over with the Enlightenment. And so there's something that historians refer to as the dual revolution, which is the revolution that propelled us into the modern era, which is the era that we live in now. And there was two tracks to this dual revolution, a political track and an economic track. Politically, the Enlightenment; economically, the Industrial Revolution. And they both happened in tandem, starting in the 18th century, that is the 1700s. So I'll start with the political side of the dual revolution. So the United States is the our founding documents are the quintessential documents of the Enlightenment. They're really the apotheosis of a century of Enlightenment thought. All men are created equal. We hold these truths to be self-evident, etc. That's 1776. The American Revolution. The French Revolution was in 1789. Napoleon will carry the liberty, equality, and fraternity in the Napoleonic Code, the abolition of serfdom, the abolition of aristocratic privilege, the abolition of divine right, with his armies to the other capitals of Europe. And if everyone is equal under the law, then there is no more basis for the legal discrimination that existed against Jews, because the Jews are a religious minority. And if we say that the state is forbidden from taking an individual citizen's religion into account, then Jewish emancipation should have put an end to anti-Semitism. I will say the founding fathers of the United States were keenly aware of the Jews. If you go to Savannah, Georgia, you can find one of the oldest synagogues in the United States, a congregation that long predated even the revolution, and who had correspondence with George Washington after the Revolutionary War. And George Washington congratulated them and basically wrote them a letter that said, "Aren't you glad you aren't in Europe anymore? Because in this country, the government is not going to subject you to legal discrimination," unlike anywhere in Europe at the time of the American Revolution. I'm going to leave, just in the interest of time. I am not going to talk much about the rest of the American experience in the 19th century. And other than to just point out briefly here that history doesn't repeat, it just never stops. And the forces of democratization and the forces of exclusion have been fighting a nonstop battle in the United States since its foundation over slavery, over Native Americans, over immigration law, over anti-miscegenation laws, etc. But we're going to leave that and instead move over to talking about the second part of the dual revolution, all of which is necessary context for what follows, which is the economic modernization. And so here I have a locomotive as a kind of symbol of that, progress. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, 85% of human activity on Earth since the agricultural revolution tens of thousands of years ago was poking holes in the dirt so there'd be food for next year. 85% of human activity was dedicated to agricultural pursuits before the Industrial Revolution. And try to appreciate the magnitude of these upheavals just in the realm of science and technology and industry. So right now, I mean, in the United States, what, at most 100,000 coal miners have been in the West Virginia coal miners have been central to the national conversation as an exemplary group whose way of life is just going away, right? A tiny, almost, there are more scuba divers in the United States than there are coal miners by far. And yet, because their way of life is going away, they're recognized and whatnot. Now imagine if the livelihoods of 85% of the population was going away, was going to be utterly transformed beyond all recognition. Massive social upheaval is entailed. I think in most of our lifetimes, we all remember when we first got an email address, right? I know I certainly do, or the first computer that we got in our house. And so, you know, we're part of this too. And you can imagine in the 19th century, when they put the train tracks in, or when I saw the first car that I ever saw, right? So all of this is very disorienting, very disorienting. And science is proceeding apace. So what is called the scientific revolution began at the same time as the wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants in Europe, the 1600s, and it has never stopped, and it continued right through the 19th century, and it's continuing today in the 21st century. Science, chemistry, electricity, the lights come on in the 19th century, you name it, right? A telegraph line between New York and London under the sea. It's a big deal. And there were tremendous advances in biology as well in the 19th century. And so here we have to mention 1859, Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, which has certainly stood the test of time. I mean, it provided the core insight on which all modern biology is based. I don't need to tell anybody here this, but I mean, you know, evolutionary speciation by natural selection is a theory. Plate tectonics is a theory. Gravity is a theory. Electromagnetism is a theory. And there is a germ theory of disease. Theory is as high as you can get in science. It's a model of reality. This one happens to work. This one happens to accord with everything we have come to find out about genetics, epidemiology, archaeology. It's in accord with geography, agriculture, animal husbandry, et cetera, et cetera. This is real. This isn't alchemy. However, this real science, the science of biology, gets put to political service by pseudoscientific hacks to explain this. This is a map of the Eastern Hemisphere in 1900. So put aside what white Americans have done on the continent of North America, driving the Native Americans to the most godforsaken places imaginable, locking them in the reservations, slavery, and so on. Elsewhere in the world, European empires were conquering vast swaths of territory, basically all of it, outside of Japan and China. This is the heyday of European imperialism, particularly the last 3 decades of the 19th century up until the First World War. The social Darwinism, or putatively scientific racism, was concocted in the 19th century to both explain this process and to justify white supremacy. I mean, there was global white supremacy basically in the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, white supremacy ruled the world with a few holdouts. And racism, scientific racism, was created to provide that an explanation for that and to justify its ongoing supremacy. Of course, we know what actually enabled this was precisely the dual revolution. Nationalism, which followed, was able to place, tremendous numbers of guys in harness to the direction, subject to the commands of centralized states, and industry provided the weapons to do it. And so there's no mystery about how this happened, but the development of scientific racism happened in tandem with imperialism. Racism and imperialism are co-joined. And so here we have an example of the kind of science that scientific racists produced in the late 19th century, which is totally abominable and, of course, now completely discredited by real science. So we know that I share 40% of my DNA with a banana, and that the difference between a human and a chimpanzee is something like 1% of overall genetic material. So there is the differences between the so-called races are exceedingly superficial when you get to their actual genetic basis. This is Joseph Arthur, the Count of Gobineau, a French theorist who is a contemporary of Karl Marx and tried to do with race what Marx did with class, which is to say, I have the key that unlocks history. I have identified the engine of history. And it's not class like Marx says, it's race. And all of history, and so Gobineau is formative, but there's a whole community of these guys. History is just a nonstop race war. All of history is a war of race against race for territory and resources to expand the race, and we shouldn't be guilty about it. It's just nature. In this scheme, race is identified as being congruent with language group. And so, there are some assumptions that the 19th century racial philosophers made about race. And the fundamental one is that races are congruent with the languages that they speak and the nation states that they control. And so there's German race and so on and so on. Okay. So, and of course, this still has currency today, which I'll be coming to. So now I want to, having laid this out, sketched this out at the very least, I hope adequately, I want to focus in on what was happening with German or the Germanophone community of racial thinkers in the 19th century. So here is a map showing Germany. This is 1871. So the year that the German nation state was created, following a decade of wars between Prussia and Denmark, Prussia and Austria, Prussia and its little German statelet allies against France, finally culminating in the solidification of the German national state under Bismarck and William I in 1871. There was a movement among German intellectuals who called themselves the cultural pessimists. And so this is a picture of Essen. This is a photograph of Essen after German national unification. So who were the cultural pessimists? This is a little complicated to describe, but they are basically people who feel dissociated with the process of modernization, alienated from the way that they perceive their society changing around them in the face of the dual revolution. Uh, so superficially, we can say, that industry is marring the German landscape. They harken back to a kind of romantic vision of mountains and castles and clean rivers and little dwarfs, and everything is cute and gemütlich, and they see these black smokestacks spewing, right, as ruining the environment. It's also taking all of the people who used to be good farmers and putting them in, making them turn into pale, pasty, skeletal workers who are doing repetitive motion tasks in these gross, smelly, disease-infested cities and so on. They also see, as the economy modernizes and develops, people who occupy certain professions like little cobblers and barrel makers and shoemakers and you name it, the mom and pop stores and the little artisanal craft shops and stuff being obliterated by industry and by big retail capitalism, which they reject. They're afraid of the encroachment of godless socialist and communist ideas, which they regard as un-German, even though Karl Marx was German, who just responded to all of this in a different way, incidentally. And what they're really disoriented by is the division that the parliamentary system revealed in Germany. So the cultural pessimists were all nationalists in the 1860s during Bismarck's Wars of Unification. And I don't doubt that the Germans felt really united during the process of constructing their national state. But once that national state was in place and it took the form of a constitutional monarchy, okay, so emphasis on the monarchy part, but there were multiple parties and all men could vote. What they apprehended was that all of these Germans are now voting against each other, voting for the nationalists, voting for the socialists, voting for the Catholic Party, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, what they didn't realize is that all of those divisions pre-existed the establishment of a parliamentary system, but they took the parliamentary system itself as the divisive thing. And so while all of this is happening, of course, Jews who had been utterly excluded from medieval German society have been making good and capitalizing, no pun intended, on the new opportunities provided to them by their emancipation, which for most places in Germany went back to 1806 and long preceded German national unification. But the cultural pessimists who, for whatever reason, have a kind of nostalgia for feudalism and the good old days when you could eat beets for the winter, saw all of these Jews who had previously been utterly marginalized and invisible in society, suddenly occupying more and more prestigious, lucrative, and conspicuous places in society, in law, in journalism, even in government. And so it's true that the Jewish minority, wherever it was emancipated, whether we're talking about the United States or France or Germany, did very well for themselves in the context of legal equality. It's easily explained by the fact that in this context, this modernizing context, they had been excluded from all of the traditional spheres of activity. And so because they had nothing invested in the pre-emancipation system, since they were kept on the outside, they're in a uniquely good position to take advantage of the new opportunities. And so the cultural pessimists, in a nutshell, what it all boils down to is that the cultural pessimists identified the Jews with everything that was changing that they didn't like. Department stores, communism, factories, changing landscape, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so who are some of these individuals? So now we're talking about some specific people who contributed to the intellectual incubator of Adolf Hitler, ultimately. So this is William Marr. He's the one in 1873 who coined the term anti-Semitism. Wilhelm Marr coined the term anti-Semitism and founded a political party, a single-issue political party called the Anti-Semitic League. And so anti-Semitism, that word didn't exist before, but it's completely of a piece with 19th century racial thinking, which is to say that I'm not against Judaism, because the religious dimension is immaterial. I'm against the Jewish race, and that race is signified by the language that those people speak. Hebrew, like Aramaic and Arabic, is a Semitic language. And so because the only Semitic language that's spoken in Germany is Hebrew, is what some few people in the Jewish minority speak, anti-Semitism means we don't like the Jews. And so he gives it a name, which is really important. The next one is Otto Glagau, who's in the middle of this. This says, eine Deutsche Sieben, die die Juden nicht lieben, a German 7 who are not beloved of the Jews. Glagau describes what I just told you. Glagau's greatest quote was that the social question is the Jewish question. What ails Germany is this racially alien minority who stands behind everything that we're against, like a free press, and so on. So the social question is the Jewish question. The reason that we appear to have lost our unity that we all felt in the 1860s is because the Jews are ruining everything. And he had a magazine, and guess what the magazine was called? The Culture Warrior. He styled himself a culture warrior. He liked to fight Germany's culture wars as an anti-Semitic blowhard. This is Adolf Stoecker. Stoecker has an important contribution to all of this because Stoecker is the first bridge between German anti-Semitic intellectuals and German politics. So Stoecker was a high-level Lutheran pastor in Berlin, a member of the Christian Social Party. And Stoecker's concern was that the giant working class tenement towns surrounding all of the factories in Berlin were incubators for godless communism and atheism and socialism, and he wanted to minister to those people. And so for strategic reasons, to undercut the appeal of the socialist message in these working class areas, he had recourse to preach the sort of social justice elements in the New Testament. Jesus says that you are your brother's keeper and so on, and he wants you to take care of each other and stuff, and so vote conservative. And they weren't buying what he was selling. But he found that if he introduced anti-Semitic themes by saying, not only am I promoting the kind of social justice message of the gospel, but also the reason that you're suffering is because of the Jewish owners, all of a sudden he could get a little bit of interest. But the people who started listening to Stoecker the most were not working class people, who by and large rejected his message, but people who were just on the bubble, one economic setback away from being cast down into the working class, people we call the petty bourgeoisie. And they ate up Stoecker's message. We're good Christians, we take care of each other, but everything that's wrong is the Jews' fault. So Stoecker helped us out with that. But if you want to find the really venomous German anti-Semites, the really nasty ones, you have to actually leave Germany and go to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which after all is where Hitler was from. And so this is Karl Lueger, another pioneer in the political use of anti-Semitism. This guy occupied for a long time, a couple decades, the mayoralty of Vienna. So he was the mayor of the capital city of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which I'll just parenthetically say was not a polity that had a lot of elected positions in it. But he controlled his. He was a member of something called the Christian Social Party by marrying anti-Jewish bigotry to a message of Christian solidarity and social welfare. And Hitler was a huge admirer of this guy if you read Mein Kampf. Hitler talks all about Karl Lueger. Finally, in 1892, the German Conservative Party determines to make anti-Semitism an official party plank on its platform. So we're going to officially become, we the Conservative Party are going to officially become an anti-Semitic organization. And then they decided that in 1892, apparently totally cynically, because they observed that various single-issue anti-Semitic parties like Wilhelm Marr's Anti-Semitic League would consistently get 1 or 2% at the polls, and they could just vacuum those up. And so they added the following language in 1892 to their platform, which is this, quote, "We fight against the often obtrusive and corrosive Jewish influence on our national life. We demand Christian authorities for the Christian people and Christian teachers for Christian students." And now that the Tivoli program was adopted, this is the Tivoli Brewery at Kreuzberg in Berlin, where that motion was carried. Now everybody in German politics has to take a position on the quote unquote Jewish question, up to and including whether or not they think it even exists. And so conservatives mainstreamed anti-Semitism, made it quote unquote respectable. All right. And so that brings me to my final topic, which is Hitler's anti-Semitism. So Hitler was a big innovator in the area of anti-Semitism. He imbibed all of the discourse about scientific racism and so on that was current in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, left the Austro-Hungarian Empire to fight in the German army during World War I because he didn't want Croats and Hungarians watching his back. He wanted good German people watching his back. And of course, when Germany loses that war, Hitler promulgates his big lie that the liberals, the socialists, and the Jews stabbed the German army in the back. We were never defeated on the battlefield. We were still occupying foreign territory, and yet we capitulated because of traitors at home. The liberals, the socialists, and the Jews betrayed us. And in this lie, he was abetted by all of the traditional German conservatives and the nationalists and the people who actually lost the war, such as Field Marshal von Hindenburg, who lied to Congress about why Germany lost the war. After Germany lost the war, he lied and said it was communist subversion in the ranks of the armed forces. Otherwise, we would have had it. That's the same guy who showed the Kaiser the spreadsheets that said, we're just going to run out of people. It's impossible to win after the failure of the spring 1918 offensive, but he'll lie about it to save face and play right into the hands of Hitler and these people harboring these resentments. Hitler attempts a coup. He uses his Nazi party militia in 1923 to overthrow a state government in Bavaria. Conservative judges who like his message decide to give him a slap on the wrist and let him use the witness stand as a soapbox, making Hitler a national figure, and giving Hitler the opportunity to write a manifesto called Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which contains a grand unified theory of world Jewish conspiracy. And so I contend that you can have a giant population of bigots who make life bad for all the people they hate and still not have a Holocaust. I contend that what you need for there to be a Holocaust is a conspiratorial fantasy, which Hitler is able to provide. That in fact there is a series of world Jewish conspiracies perpetrated against the white race by the Jews. The first world Jewish conspiracy in Hitler's mind is Christianity itself. Christ was Jewish, Paul was Jewish, all the authors of the gospel were Jewish, and they taught to turn the other cheek. They taught white people that they need to turn the other cheek and love their enemy. They, in other words, attempted to program the white race in its most powerful avatar, the Roman Empire, for suicide. They failed, but the Roman Empire did collapse, and white civilization descended into 1,000 years of darkness. The second world Jewish conspiracy by Hitler's lights is liberalism. Liberalism, so the good, healthy racial instinct of Europeans in the Middle Ages kept the Jews at bay, kept them at arm's length, kept them in the ghetto, kept them from mixing. But liberalism removes all of those strictures on Jewish activity, and it artificially levels the playing field for them. So liberalism gets the Jews' foot in the door. And then the ultimate world Jewish conspiracy, if you're Hitler, is Judeo-Bolshevism. Judeo-Bolshevism, taken from the name of the Russian communists who succeeded in seizing state power under Lenin in 1917. Judeo-Bolshevism. And so this is the imaginary enemy that Hitler constitutes Nazi Germany to fight against. It's the omni-pernicious eternal Jew who is the mastermind behind the scenes and is running circles around the white race. So on the one hand, there's American capitalism, which has the effect, this kind of consumerism that has the effect of totally eroding national distinctiveness and culture in the face of just dollars. And then on the other side, there's godless, atheistic, Marxist communism, which teaches that race is an epiphenomenon, that race is a form of false consciousness, and is trying to make the white race forget that it exists, which will make it vulnerable to miscegenation and racial pollution and gradual deterioration and finally, ultimately, disintegration into muttitude. And so both of these are Jewish conspiracies that are aimed at us, and the Jews are behind it all. And if you actually believe that, if you really believe there's a grand conspiracy that is aimed at totally eliminating your entire way of life and everything that you believe in, there is nothing you won't do to stop them, even if they're not real. So, of course, all of these ideas are still with us. I'm showing you this chart. This is, I'll be wrapping up, and it'll take me 5 or 6 more minutes. So I apologize. But this is a chart showing the electoral fortunes of the Nazi Party and its competitors in Weimar Germany before Hitler became chancellor. And this is really important. As teachers, I think it's really important that you know this. So after Hitler wrote Mein Kampf and got out of jail, on his platform of anti-Semitism, he got nowhere. He built a national organization, but he didn't even get enough votes nationally to have 1 seat in the German parliament. Then came the Great Depression, which suddenly people are tuned to the words of a magic man who is promising them the moon. And of course, the total ineptitude of the conservative government and its response, its austerity response to the Great Depression, meant that things only got worse from 1929 onward. And as the Depression deepened, the Nazis reached their pinnacle of popularity, which is 37.27%. which means they have a plurality in the summer 1932 elections. They were the most popular party, but they were never voted in. Hitler did not come to power by the popular will. Hitler became chancellor in coalition with the conservatives and the Catholics, who believed that they could control him. When he became chancellor, he had a vice chancellor and only controlled 3 of 11 ministries. And so that's just a that's a fundamental thing you got to know. Now, I will conclude. All of these ideas are still with us, and there are still people who espouse them everywhere. So this is obviously created by an American anti-Semite. So the artist who drew this is an American. So that one guy who stormed the Capitol in January with a shirt that said 6 million wasn't enough, these people are still with us. Just about exactly a month ago, a van full of these people showed up at the center in Maitland with a bullhorn and literature and posters. And so sometimes the chimeric notions are vintage 1930s, just blatantly Nazi. Sometimes they take a more innovative 21st century guys, but they propagate. They propagate. The word propaganda comes from the word propagate, which is reproduce. Propaganda propagates. It reproduces like fungus on a brain. That's what it is. And what this fungus does is replaces an individual's critical faculties with talking points. And eventually, the host can no longer think or speak in their own words, but only use someone else's. And it doesn't require insane people. It only requires people who believe insane things. There's a quote that's attributed to Voltaire. It's not really exactly what he said, but it doesn't matter. The quote is, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." I think that is absolutely true. And so there are people out there who harbor xenophobic prejudices, who feel threatened because their way of life is changing, just like the way of life changed in the High Middle Ages and gave rise to the blood libel and the idea of desecration of the host, just like in the 19th century, the upheaval brought by the dual revolution made people feel insecure that their world was changing, it was beyond their control and whatever. There are people who harbor xenophobic prejudices and who harbor grievances about the way they think things are changing that disadvantage them. And they are meat for the armies of demagogues who will not find it difficult to get them to believe in chimeric fantasies by amplifying and playing to their grievances. And once those chimeric fantasies are believed, there is nothing that is not on the table as far as what they might do. They don't all have to be fanatics either. They just have to tolerate fanatics in their coalition. So don't sit around waiting for history to repeat itself. Don't sit around and wait for the next domino to fall that can be compared exactly to what Hitler did. History doesn't repeat. It just doesn't stop. It's ongoing. The struggle between reason and unreason, between democratizing forces and exclusionary forces, just has never stopped. And the people who fought against it in the Nazi era, right, are one set, and the people who are fighting against it now are another set. But it's just an ongoing contest. The things that made Nazism and the Holocaust possible are still with us. They are the innate weaknesses of humankind. And this is where you come in. This is the last thing I'm going to say. You as educators are our first and best line of defense. Teaching people valid explanations for the way things are. Teaching people the way things actually work without recourse to evil conspiracy theories and so on, right? Teaching them how to find more information that's reliable from experts based on peer review, right? And teaching them to be on their guard because their minds are the targets of propagandists. And so that's all I wanted to say, really.
Well, that was great. Are you looking? I hope you're looking at your comments. You've only got a couple of questions, but you've got lots of looks like a little applause here. Everyone really has hung in tight, especially a good solid group stayed in here at the end, and we really appreciate it. Thank you again also for staying late today as well. I really appreciate it. I mean, we got to hear everyone's phenomenal presentations. This is just really, really fantastic. I am gonna, let's see. It's been a great day. I hope we had a couple of technical glitches today, but with Dr. Plavnieks, Dr. Messina, and Dr. Katz, I hope you found today enlightening and engaging. I know that there are some of you who are in here who are in ELA classes, or English or reading and counseling. I know not everyone puts when they go through the feedback, I put a question in there looking at how to use this, to create a lesson, but also one thing I neglected to put is, has it helped you understand the Holocaust better? Causes of understanding anti-Semitism, has it helped you in your understanding? So when you present or you talk about the Holocaust, you feel like you want to dig in more, you want to understand more. Has it helped, peel back those layers to, help you understand? And that's, I didn't put in, but I want you to be thinking about that, because there's a lot to take in here. And honestly, in a week, you're not going to understand everything. In years, I don't understand everything, and I'm still learning more. These phenomenal presentations, great speakers like Richard's. I mean, it's been fantastic. Tomorrow there is a session. There's actually a video I'd like you to watch for Dr. Stanton before he presents on Friday morning. And then there's also a videos I'm Still Here, which is a kind of looking at the salvaged pages. You may have already seen it. If you have, just leave some feedback on it. But it's I'm Still Here is a really great video for you to watch. It's not very long, but it's a glimpse into the salvaged pages, book by Alexander Zapruder, and we'll be covering that last on Friday. And then during the morning, first thing, I'll be doing a live showing of De Vela, which is the Wave. It is not the version, if you saw the 80s version of the Wave, this is a different take on that. I personally like it more. There's a lot of dramatization in it. There's a lot of liberties taken, but it's really interesting. It was very engaging. And I have a lot of students that tell me after they've watched it, it gives them a different lens to look through when thinking about the rise of these types of cults and groups and organizations that and actually looking at the downtrodden and how they attract to these types of leaders. So I think it's interesting enough for us to talk about after even watching. So if you've got the time, that is optional, but I'm going to play it. It's not easy to find it, so I have an account that I already have access to. Hopefully it won't be too choppy or you'll be able to see it, but it is subtitled, so you'll have to read. And if you've got any questions, reach out to me. The great discussions that are taking place every night, I mean, they're just fantastic. I'm still blown away. I keep showing people, I said my phone buzz, buzz, buzz. Lots of great questions and engagement. I really, really appreciate it. If anybody's got any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And other than that, if I see you tomorrow, fantastic, watch the shows. If I don't, I'll see you on Friday morning for Dr. Gregory Stanton and the 10 stages of genocide. We have some other, and also Stacy Nowak, who's going to talk about who's going to address analyzing photography and the Auschwitz album with a lesson from Yad Vashem. That's a great primary source analysis activity that you can use. And I think we'll have a great way to wrap up everything on Friday. But Richard, Dr. Plavnieks, thank you so much for coming in today. Really appreciate it. Dr. Messina, thank you so much for coming in all the way across the world. We're just so excited to have you. Everyone else, thank you for tuning in today and being with us. And I really appreciate all of you very much. And I will leave it at that and let you go enjoy time with your families.